Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Michener Art Museum virtual program, Cultural Connections, Textiles, and Context. This is the first of three programs that explore the art of Anila Agha and specifically its connections to textiles. The exhibit, Anila Agha Interwoven, is currently on display at the Michener. I hope that you all have stopped by and seen it, and if you haven't, you have to go or go again. This exhibit surveys 2 decades of Anila's practice across media, including sculpture, embroidery, painting, and drawing. I'm sure her sculptures are what capture your attention first because they're large and they project the light. But tonight we're going to look at some of her more her pieces that are on the wall. They're a little bit more subtle, but extremely intricate, and we're going to investigate their inspiration. So our virtual program tonight, Cultural Connections, Textiles in Context, I will be with our Director of Exhibitions, Joshua Lessard, and Katy Rosenthal Jackson. They will explore the connection between pattern, motif, and materials in Indo-Islamic textiles. Katy Rosenthal Jackson is a PhD candidate in History of Art at Bryn Mawr College. She's studying fashion and textiles in South Asia and China during the modern era, with an emphasis on material and cultural interchange. Joshua Lessard is the current Director of Exhibitions at the Michener, and he designed this exhibit and the beautiful display in our Martin Wing. So at this point, I will turn it over to Joshua. If you have any questions, please enter them into the Q&A and we will work them into the discussion or at the end.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jen. As Jen mentioned, I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction. I'm going to start talking about some of the pieces of the exhibition itself to provide some context, and then we're going to pop over to Katy to get us into those sort of textiles and inspirations piece in a moment. But first, I want to start with a quote from the exhibition's curator, Jeremiah McCarthy. I think captures an essence of what we're kind of getting at tonight. So while you're looking at this image of one of the pieces in the show, I'm going to read, here we go. Anila Agha is saying not only should we be looking at light, but that this is also culturally coded. There's a cultural dimension to how we think about light and how we think about light in space. And so that cultural coding, that sort of context making is what we're probing a little bit this evening with you all, so you can understand some of the work in the show a little bit better. And specifies, we're going to take a little bit of a tour of some of the bigger pieces, the most familiar ones that you've probably seen in some of the promotional imagery or of Anila's work that you might be familiar with before. And then I'll pop over to Katy to talk about the other pieces. So here we go. So first and foremost, I also want to give a great thank you to everyone at the museum, at the Westmoreland, at all of the loaning institutions who helped us pull together this particular showing of this exhibition, Interwoven. As I say here, it takes a village, and so a great thank you to the many, many hands and people who helped make this a reality. And for those of you who don't know, this is Anila Agha. This is Anila Agha. And so she is an absolute delight of a person. She comes from a practice that is extremely multivalent. She talks a lot about her experiences growing up in Lahore in Pakistan, and then coming to the United States and sort of what that journey, that artistic journey was as she made sort of these world travels and kind of moving around. You can see here on the left, these are some images of her in the studio working on some of these very intricate pieces. And on the right, we have a great photo of her in our exhibition space with the sort of one of the marquee objects for the show, All the Flowers Are For Me, directly behind her. Now to break down some of these major motifs in pattern, right? We have on the left side here, one of the pieces in the show. This is called Flight of a Thousand Birds. And on the right, we have a photo of the tile installation in the bath portion of the Alhambra. And so this is this idea. We have these sort of Moorish influences, these sort of Islamic influence coming through all the way to Europe, right? These are in Spain today. And if you're otherwise unfamiliar with it, you can actually see how these patterns were directly translated. So from the tile that you see here on the right becomes the inspiration for the piece on the left. Anila is playing with these complex patterns, these complex ideas in a multivalent sense, right? That this idea that these are not static, these are not, if this is just made in tile here, it's not only made to be in tile, it's made to be translated into other things and have a lot to say about that. One of the other things that she's playing with often, which is a very architectural thing, is light and shadow. One of the things that Anila talks about rather extensively in the audio tour, if you join the audio tour and you listen to it when you're on the exhibition floor, you'll hear her talk about spending a lot of time growing up in Lahore, which she calls the hotbed of medieval buildings from the Mughal 11th century onwards. So you can imagine this sort of very romantic history that she's kind of growing up around. And likewise, visiting a series of tombs and structures in Lahore and looking up at the marble jali are the carved marble stone screens. And so what you can see is sort of the influences of the screens, the idea of the light permeating, the shadow permeating, that interplay of light and shadow, dancing on the floor, the architecture beyond, is influencing the way that she's thinking. Uh, the images here on the screen, on the left side, we have one of the pieces in the show called Teardrop. It's the marquee entrance object. And on the right side here, we have an iron gate at the Al Rafia Mosque in Cairo, which you can, I think, hopefully very quickly see a lot of the similarities, inspirations drawn between them, and the interplay of light and shadow in those spaces. Now, another major motif is the power of ideas. And particularly what I kind of like about this is the idea that words matter. So what you'll see is that there are both decorative motifs, but I think we often think of decoration as purely aesthetic, that it is a whimsy, a sort of like a decorative thing exclusively. And I think what is beautiful about the way that Anila is using um, the patterns and the motifs that she is that they are carrying weight, they're carrying meaning. So there's a lot going on inside of that. Whether it's a memory, whether it's nostalgia, whether it's inviting you to probe something further, whether it is just beauty, they're all kind of doing this presentational and technical work and inviting you into the space and sort of interpreting the piece. Likewise, if you're familiar with a lot of the artwork and architectural elements in the Islamic world as a whole, there is also a great deal of calligraphy that appears in the architectural space. And I think that Anila does employ that in her work. We see a detail shot of one of the first pieces in the show that you'll see in terms of the chronology. It's the earliest piece in this exhibit. And on the bottom right corner of this piece, which is called Hesiat, you will see that she has additional calligraphic elements that she is writing, which is Urdu written in Arabic. And so you can kind of see what's going on in there. And we unpack that for you as well. And then one of the last sort of major motifs that we're sort of picking up on is the idea of symbols and semiotics. So if you are familiar, the idea of a symbol and semiotics is that there is something that is being represented or signified, and then there is the signifier. There's this interplay between the visual representation of an object and then what it means to us. And so Anila plays a lot with these preconceptions. She's sort of adapting things that she's seen around her world and then moving them into other artistic media. So here what you'll see on the screen are parts of the necropolis. There's a very sort of famous necropolis in Pakistan. Um, and this is particularly the tomb of Nizamuddin II, which has a lot of Gujarati influences, but also um, major elements that are sort of geometric in origin. But there's one detail that I kind of want to draw your attention to here, which are these sort of rondelles. And the necropolis at Makli is a very, very large. It's maybe one of the largest necropolises in the world. And it has tombs of men and women. And what Anila is sort of probing here are these ideas that she's seeing elements that were used in decorative motifs that were represented in women's work, women's space. They sort of represented those spaces and they're being translated into stone. And so then she's sort of taking these motifs and kind of bringing them back into other elements. And so the artwork associated with that, you can see here on the left, which is called Rites of Passage. And you can also see some of these elements reappearing, the sort of the floral motifs, the rondelle, the sort of circle inside of a square motif in that piece, All the Flowers Are For Me. And if we look at the detail here, what you'll also see, this is a detail of rites of passage, or 4 details of rites of passage. And you'll also see that not only are these encaustic panels, but they are also decorated with tiny beads, right? This is something that she's embroidering her work. She's bringing thread and fiber arts into the work that she's doing. And she's also bringing in a lot of glass beadwork, which is a common thread throughout. I encourage you, when you do come to the show, not only to rush between the major elements, but to slow down in the middle and kind of look at each of these wall pieces individually, and really take it in, because there's an exquisite amount of detail and mind-blowing amount of detail in a lot of these pieces. And I want you to make sure that you get a sense of it all. Okay, now I'm going to pass the baton to Katy. And while we're doing that, I also want to just quickly, because I am the objects guy, right? I encourage everyone to think about objects when preparing for this. I was thinking about the theme of interwoven and all of these things, and I was looking around my own house, right? I live in a Victorian row home in West Philadelphia, and I couldn't help but notice that these patterns and motifs appear everywhere. So I have, inside of my house, there's a wallpaper detail swatch, right, of a damask where you're seeing a lot of these floret motifs appearing as well. We have a wallpaper stamp, right, where a lot of these patterns come up again and again. Katy, these are probably also very familiar to you. We have a lassi cup, right? So this is for the yogurt drink lassi. It comes from Pakistan, but you can see on it the filigree work in the repoussé here are all these motifs that we're talking about. I have a tiny little jewelry box, which again has a silver filigree on it. So I think the idea here is that not only are these motifs exclusive to one space, but in the interwoven contexts, as someone who's traveling the world, Anila wants us to also consider these in the context of our own spaces and our own environments. I couldn't help but notice that they were everywhere around me. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Katy. She's going to talk a little bit about those contexts historically and bring it, I think, around to the contemporary moment.
Thank you so much. I loved getting to see some of those examples from your home. That's great. I'm going to just share my PowerPoint here. Is it coming up? Okay, great. Okay, so firstly, I just wanted to quickly express my gratitude for getting to talk with you today about this incredible show and Anila Agha's beautiful, beautiful contemporary work alongside some historical objects that I've selected from the local Penn Museum collection to bring those two into conversation together tonight. Okay. Okay. Um, so as Joshua kind of set up really nicely, the two main elements that I want to focus on, there's so much that we could talk about in conversation between textiles and Agha's work. But I want to really focus on two elements, which are pattern and light. And I think pattern is one of the main reasons that textiles really come to mind when we are engaging with Anila's work. Even though they are rendered sometimes in steel, kind of things that are pretty opposite materially to textiles. But we still can really clearly see this connection. And I think a big part of that is just this use of pattern as a as her primary mode of image making is really using pattern. And then light as well, which I would say is less obviously related to textiles. So hopefully that is an illuminating way to get to think about a medium where light is not always really part of the conversation. And Agha herself describes her work as poetic, and pattern and light are two of the kind of rhetorical elements that she uses to bring poetry and the types of meaning that we get from words, as you were saying, Joshua, can be communicated without words, right, through these types of formal concerns. So that's a little bit of how I want to look at how textile artists create sensory experience as well using these types of elements. Okay, so diving in here, the first textile that I wanted to share with you is this gorgeous piece of velvet. It's a special type of velvet referred to in Turkish as çatma, which was a famous product of the Ottoman Empire from around the mid 15th through the 17th centuries. And luxurious velvets like çatma were not only favored at Ottoman courts, but also the courts of Safavid Iran and Mughal India. And so they give us a sense of a shared elite culture in the early modern Islamic world. And çatma is a brocade, which is a complex type of woven fabric where there is a foundational weave, and then there's an additional layer of patterning threads that are not structural. They kind of are interwoven with the foundational weave, but they also sit atop it. And the pattern is created by alternating different types of threads across the textile. So here, the pattern is created by alternating silks that have been dyed with red dye and yellow dye, and silk that has been wrapped in metal. And çatma is referred to as a voided velvet because the velvet weave is not present across the entire textile, as we can see here. And what the areas that would be referred to as voided are what we see here, filled with the thread that was wrapped in metal, much of which is deteriorated here. So thinking about light here, we have a lot of different techniques and textures going on. And one of the main reasons that silk is prized as a fiber is because it has a very long, unbroken filament as its structure. And that smooth texture of the long, unbroken filament is what makes silk so excellent at refracting light and makes it shinier than, say, cotton. But in velvet, like what we're looking at here, the threads are cut so that they're standing straight up from the fabric, and we call that a pile. Maybe some of you know this just from living with velvets. And what that does is it completely disrupts the refraction of light. So when we are looking at a velvet straight on like this, we're actually seeing the deepest possible tone of that silk that we can see. And at the same time, because the pile has length, we're also catching glimpses of the sides of the filament of the silk. And it's that combination of kind of the deepest tones of the fiber and the sides of the fiber that are refracting light that gives velvet that incredible depth and shimmering quality that we so value about that textile. And of course, the effects here are paralleled with the metal wrapped thread, which are all about refracting light back to us, but with a completely different texture. You know, the velvet sort of calls out to be touched, and the metal, it's not as much what we associate with those kind of softer tactile feelings. And so it's the contrast between those two materials in the same textile that transforms these çatma velvets into a really kind of alluring landscape of light and shadow, which is something that we see so much across Agha's work. And I think this is just another beautiful detail of the design. And I think that more than any other textile we're going to look at tonight, the motifs of this floral design are the most directly related to the kinds that we see in Agha's patterns. For example, here, we can see it particularly in the arching of feathery leaves with serrated edges, and this is referred to as Saz style, which was widely used in the Ottoman aesthetic across media. But the logic of how the patterns are designed to repeat is quite different. And both pieces use programmatic techniques to repeat smaller design units into larger patterns. And what I mean by programmatic is that these smaller design units are not all repeated out individually by hand. They are in some way programmed to repeat out, right? Okay, so in the Chetna, this is one repeat unit. And we can even further divide it. So we can't divide it this way, but we can divide it along the vertical axis because it has vertical symmetry. So we can chop that in half, and we can mirror that one unit to theoretically repeat endlessly this pattern, right? And then we can see that these two rows of the ogival motifs are actually exactly the same. So we can cut it down actually just to this one small design repeat unit, right? And this is huge in terms of design labor, because creating a weave like this is incredibly complex. It requires a lot of math. It requires a lot of material and technical knowledge. So designers have strategies for how to manage that work. And not you also get the added benefit of symmetry and repetition in pattern being, appealing design elements. But it also reduces design labor. And the way that this gets repeated materially and not just theoretically is on the loom. And the draw loom that is used to weave textiles like this is basically a patterning machine, right? So it can take this unit and do this repetition. And so I can answer questions about this in the Q&A. It's a little bit technical, but essentially the repeat unit gets programmed into the loom as it's being set up. And then weavers can work this design almost endlessly in the length. The width is limited by the width of the loom, but in terms of the length, the weavers can kind of just keep going and going, even with a very complex design. And this is quite different from other modes of patterning textiles like embroidery, where there is no automation of the repeat to eliminate some of that hand labor. Because in embroidery, anytime, even if you have a repeating design, each motif has to individually be stitched, right? And I think that type of laborious act is some of what Agha draws on in her works, where she is really celebrating the act of stitching, right? And then looking at how the repetition of pattern operates in this piece, All the Flowers Are For Me, we can similarly break down Agha's design on each side of the cube, we can find where there is symmetry and break it down into smaller repeat units. But the way that the pattern is repeating out to fill this space, really the technique is the projection of light, right? And so it doesn't have the same material limitations as a woven textile. And because of this different materiality, the repetition of the pattern works at a very different speed. Once everything is set up here in this very complex installation, the repetition of the pattern out into the space actually occurs kind of instantaneously when you turn on the light, right? And you can turn it on and off with the switch of a light. And that method of projection also allows Agha to play with expansion and reduction of scale at pretty instantaneously. Oh, please, Joshua, yes.
Okay, can you hear me? Sorry, I was muted for a second. One of the things that I love about what Katie's talking about right now as well is that when you think about the repeat pattern on a human body, right, that like there's a movement and a drape, that the pattern takes on a new life. Anila in this space is also, while there is an instantaneous creation and playing of scale, the visitor, the viewer, the audience also becomes a part of the artwork, right? Because that pattern is modulating itself on your own body. So as you move around it, there's a lot more dynamism to the piece as well, in almost the same way that a piece of fabric draped on you moves with you as well. So I think that like that combination, that interplay of those two things is like really fascinating. And if you, not to make a plug in the middle of this, but if you do read the catalog, which is available in our gift shop, you will also note that like Anila very much desires for that interplay, that the viewer is itself part of the work in that way. So sorry, that was you were just like hitting it so precisely and I loved it. I wanted to just make sure that I got that in there. So thank you, Katy.
No, please don't apologize. That's great. Yeah, and I have also I've gotten to go see this in person, and I do think that is such a striking part of this piece is the way you actually can't help but be a part of it. Your body it just takes on the pattern as you're moving it around. And great, okay, so that takes me to the next, let's see. To another brocaded textile that is also made with silk and metal wrapped thread. This is a beautiful robe from Varanasi, also known as Benares, in northern India. And while Varanasi is probably best known for its sacredness, particularly for Hindus and Buddhists, it is also a great center of weaving, and it is famed for its brocades, just like this one, especially this type that incorporates metallic thread or zari, and fabrics that, especially when they predominantly feature zari, then the brocade is referred to as kimkab, which translates to little dream in Persian, which I think is pretty lovely. And weavers in Varanasi are predominantly Muslim. And this robe draws our attention to one of the primary functions of textiles that Joshua was just referring to, which is to clothe the human body. And this outer garment, which is called a choga, has Turco-Persianate origins and became a prominent feature of court dress during the Mughal era. And the bold design of this choga makes it feel almost like it is a vehicle for the wearer to get to shroud themselves in streams of light, I feel. And the diagonal stripes that would be wrapping around the wearer put these luminous threads into almost constant swirling motion. And I think that effect gets to be so pronounced because of the minimal tailoring of this garment, which leaves really large swaths of undisturbed pattern and celebrates the qualities of the textile as it envelops the body. So the general, look at this close up, it's just stunning. The general term for this type of pattern, a diagonal floral vine, is aribel, with bel meaning vine, and the alternation between the two tones, the gold and silver here, also earns it the name Ganga Yamuna, referring to two of the most significant rivers in the region. And I just love that because certainly the optical effects of bouncing between these two streams of gold and silver definitely evokes the glistening, rippling surface of water. And here I just want to go a bit more into detail about how metal thread or zari is made. And although there are many regional variations for these materials and techniques and terms, the broad strokes of the practice of turning metal into workable thread can be found across many, many cultures. And it can be adapted for many different textile constructions, including woven brocade. So on the bottom left here, we see a silver ingot or a cast piece of silver. And if the thread is going to be made into gold thread, the artisan would then plate the silver ingot by hammering thin sheets of gold onto it. And then this plated ingot gets heated and stretched through successively smaller and smaller holes in metal templates and reheated and stretched over and over until finally you have this thin wire, which is zari. And that wire can continue to be processed into a huge variety of forms. And the form that we saw both in the Ottoman Chatma and in the Kinkab from Varanasi is called kalabatu, where the zari is wrapped around a silk thread. And usually the silver zari would be wrapped around white undyed silk, and the gold-plated zari would be wrapped around silk that's dyed yellow, even though here we see that the silver is wrapped around red silk, and we can't even see what color the gold zari is wrapped around, which is pretty amazing. I mean, just the fineness of this work kind of blows my mind. And returning to the Kinkab here in the Pen Museum, we can see the more conventional pairing of the silver with white thread and the gold with yellow and orange silk threads that enhance the natural tones of the metals. And comparing it with one of Agha's pieces, we can appreciate that this really subtle interplay of shifting metallic tones and the effect that that has when it's paired with very carefully plotted diagonal line work, the dimensionality and movement that it adds really has the capacity to make these most fundamental geometric forms pulse with life. And maybe that's one way we can think about the immense time and effort and labor and valuable materials that have gone into the creation of precious textiles like this kinkab. And that brings me to another one of Agha's pieces that really meditates on this issue of labor. And it does that in part by itself being very laborious to create, and specifically requiring very repetitive labor, which is a hallmark of textile work. And it uses many of the same materials that are used to make and embellish textiles. So each of these, and maybe you can correct me with some of these numbers, maybe Joshua, but each of these roughly 12-foot long threads that amass into this flood of tears is strung with a series of 1-inch glass bugle beads. And then this is repeated hundreds of times, ultimately amplifying these really delicate beads into an installation that has quite an architectural scale. And this piece immediately reminded me of one of the textiles in the Penn Museum, the last one that I want to talk about with you tonight, which is a cotton head shawl called an odhni from Kutch in Gujarat in Western India. And it is patterned with a tie-dye technique called bandhani. And to me, there are some formal similarities that made me connect these two pieces in my mind. The rectilinear field of this glowing red, pinpricked with dots of white in a highly organized, evenly spaced, linear fashion, and then the stark contrast with this deep black. And the way that it to me, it almost looks like the needles hanging from the flood of tears could have somehow produced this odhni. And to me, that's where there's also more of a conceptual connection between these two pieces, because through the use of string and beads and needles and repetition, Agha is evoking the kinds of materials and labor used to create textiles, of which this odhni is one very specific example. And furthermore, Agha is concerned here with how the previously colonized regions in which such textiles are made are particularly vulnerable to the ongoing effects of that exploitation in the form of climate change. And the art of dyeing these bandhani textiles has long been intimately related to the natural environment and the expertise of working with natural resources, including not only natural dyestuffs, but also water with particular qualities. And the relationship to that does continue, but it has certainly been altered and jeopardized. And today, nearly all bandhani are dyed with synthetic dyes. So quite a different relationship to those natural processes. So with that in mind, I will briefly explain more about how this odhni, which was likely dyed with natural dyes, was made. So this odhni with the 5 medallion design, the red and black palette, and the wide borders identify it as a kind of odhni that can also be called a Chandra Kani, with Chandra meaning moon. And so these medallions, while floral, they can also be referred to as Padma or lotuses. The medallions carry this reference to the moon, and presumably to the star-filled sky. And these are popular shawls for Muslim Khatri women to wear for their weddings. And when worn, these medallions would be centered on the bride's back, so very prominently featured. And the communities that make bandhani are predominantly Khatri, a cultural identity that does not indicate religious affiliation. And many of the families involved in making bandhani trace their lineage to Sindh, a province in what is now southern Pakistan. And so in this process of bandhani, the transfer of the design to the cloth is traditionally done with an ochre-based pigment called geru, either by paper stencil or woodblock print or nail block print, where nails are hammered into a woodblock and used to make either indentations into the textile, kind of like that, except with nails. Yeah. And that stage of the process is traditionally done by men, and the tying is traditionally done by women, and then the dyeing is again generally done by men. So there are these kind of social structures to this process as well. And each piece of bandhani is composed of thousands of bindis or ties, of which there are many kinds. And as any of you who have tie-dyed before know, The areas that are tied is where the dye is going to be resisted. And this process is done in multiple stages in coordination with the dyers in order to make sure that the right colors are applied to the intended areas where each successive dye bath is going to be making the design. And it begins with the lightest color and progresses to the darkest. So for example, with this Odini, the entire design would first be prepared to be dyed with yellow dye, which could have been made from a mixture of turmeric and buttermilk. And only the dots that were intended to stay white would have been tied at that stage. And then the entire piece would be submerged into the yellow dye bath. And the dots intended to be left yellow would also be tied, and the entire piece would be dyed red. And then a different sewing technique called tritic would have been used to dye the larger areas of black. And tritic consists of sewing a running stitch around the shape and then gathering the fabric along the stitch to isolate that whole area. And then that area could either be dipped into the dye or dabbed with dye. And the black dye could have been achieved a few different ways, but most likely was dyed with indigo. And I just love, let me see if I can zoom in here a little bit. Yeah, I just love how you can see all of the layers of those dye baths really building up there, in what appears to be first just black. It's actually this really rich, dense combination of all of the dyes. And that complexity gives us a sense of the time that goes into this. And okay, we'll zoom out there. Oop, too far. Okay, and before tying all of the bindis, this Odini would have been folded in half. You can see the symmetry down there along the middle. And this would reduce the number of knots that have to be tied, and also assist in creating the symmetry in the design. And I think I'm running maybe a little bit low on time here. I'm not sure. I'm good. Okay. So instead of folding, this can also be done by layering two separate pieces and then stitching them together, like we see in this this example. And that seam often becomes a site of decoration. And this reminded me, I have a terrible picture, but it reminded me of one of Agha's pieces in the show called Shimmering Memories, where her stitching goes across this doubled medallion shape that looks as though it could have been folded and unfolded down the center and then seamed together with care. And it just shows that these kind of a remnant of these textile processes where these areas of joining are often also sites of decoration and have to be paid particular attention to because they are areas where stress can be put on garments, like they might tear there. So it becomes an area where more care has to be given. And that can often take on this kind of metaphorical meaning of protection. And this Odini is cotton, and dyeing cotton in particular has been a specialty of India dating back to the Indus Valley civilization. And achieving a red hue like this is especially complex. And it requires many, many processes before you can even really get to the dyeing. First, it has to be coated with a fatty substance like an oil, and then cleaned with an astringent. And then it has to be treated with a mineral mordant in order to fix the dye to the cotton fiber. Typically, alum was used. And the red dye itself would traditionally be alizarin sourced from the roots of a plant, usually madder root. And then after dyeing, the bandhani fabrics are dried in the sun. And today, bandhani are mostly sold with at least some of the bindis still tied to show that they went through this process, rather than being a printed imitation, because many are printed instead of dyed, instead of tie-dyed at this point. And it is currently estimated that more than 25,000 people earn their livelihood from tying bandhani and dyeing bandhani, just in Kutch today. And Kutch is just one of the regions where this is practiced. And so when I see Agha's flood of tears in that brilliant glowing red with hundreds of little tied threads, I see bandhani, and I see the resilience and precariousness of this and other time-intensive, climatically dependent textile art forms in an ever-changing world. So that is what I have. Thank you so much for your attention. These are some suggestions for further reading, and I'm happy to try to answer any questions that you might have.
We do have a question, Katie, from Sherry. She said, super interesting presentation on the textiles. Were the historical textiles shown tonight generally all produced by men? Just thinking about the laborious nature of handmade textile ornamentation, its association with women's work in some cultures, and how that notion may or may not factor in Agha's work.
That is an very interesting and very complex question. I would say that, kind of like the bandhani that we were just looking at, every textile is really a combination of many, many processes, and often certain processes within all of the processes that come together to make one textile often have kind of gendered associations with who's making them. But no one person is making a textile from start to finish, and generally no particular gender is making one textile from start to finish. And even with the bandhani, when talking about how, the tying is typically done by women, but the printing of the design and the dyeing is typically done by men, there's also multiple steps that happen before that to even just get the base cotton textile that's being tied and dyed. And so like spinning cotton yarn is typically done by women, but the weaving of the yarn is typically done by men. And this changes in different areas and different social contexts, but that's kind of speaking generally to some of the patterns that we see across India. But yeah, so I think the brocades in Varanasi are those would predominantly have been designed and woven by men. But there are many parts of the process, like spinning yarn, spinning thread, that are contributed to by women.
I know there's, while we're waiting for other people to add questions, there were two things, Katie, that you mentioned that I wanted to maybe just quickly follow up on, so that people, in case they were wondering, when you did show a flood of tears, there are 529 strands of beads. So if you're wondering how many, there are 529. Each one, as you mentioned, is ranges. They're all little red bugle beads that range in size from 3/4 of an inch to a full inch. So there's about 120 to 131 per strand, which means that there are between 63 and 69,000 beads in that installation. So if you're kind of wondering, when we talk about labor and the work that went into it, there are 65,000 beads on average strung up in that piece. The other thing that you mentioned when you mentioned shimmering memories is the stitching across the center of the piece. And I kind of wanted to just draw people's attention to a detail in the show, which is that a lot of these works tend to become very heavy when Anila embroiders or does the stitching on the actual paper piece. And also she's dipping them in wax, she's using a many layered process. The work gets very heavy. And so to actually secure them to the backer board in the frame, Anila has actually hand stitched many of them to the actual frame. So look for those details across the top. It's not just in the fabrication of the artwork, which I find fascinating and very unique to working with Anila, is that the actual presentation also embodies a lot of these ideas and methods as well. So they're held in place using the stitching as well. So it's a fantastic combination of things.
Thank you for adding those numbers too. That was it's helpful to have it quantified sometimes, right?
While we're waiting for another question, Sherry said thank you, by the way. Um,
Thank you, Sherry.
in the Odini, the little white circles, how big are those?
I'm trying to think of how, I mean, they're small. They're small. They're like that big. Um, I'm trying to think of what to compare them to.
So like a seed
Um,
bead, maybe?
yeah, you could probably fit a seed bead like in the middle of it kind of nicely. Yeah. Um, and this is a good plug to go see these textiles in person, which let's see, I have a slide about that as well. On October 28th at 1 p.m. at the Penn Museum, they're going to be pulling out all of the textiles that I talked about tonight, and more. So if I really can't, the same with seeing Anila Agha's work in person, we can try to convey through photos and description, but there's really nothing like getting to see these things in person and immediately the sense of scale, the sense of weight and texture and light, and it's also different than it appears on our screens or printouts. So if you can make it to this program, that would be a great way to get to see things like how tiny are the bindis.
Well, and I think as you had mentioned during when we met in person, you said that most of these are never on display. So this is a really amazing opportunity for people to see these textiles. We
Absolutely.
do have another question, Katy. Abby said, in your own research, have you encountered archival texts where writers reflect on the reflective qualities of
Mm.
metallic threads? Are there any excuse me, cultural values associated with the sensory qualities of the light that reflects from the metallic threads?
Mm, I think that I'm remembering a reference to the Kim Cobbs being um, referred to, you know, that the term in Persian kind of translates to a little dream, and certainly that is in part because of the kind of unimaginable uh, luxury of weaving with silver and gold, right? And so um, I can't recall off the top of my head the archival sources, but there are definitely historical mentions in Persian, kind of describing this as an amazing experience to see these textiles, something that could really only be dreamed of. Yeah.
All right. Can I follow up on that? Is
Please.
Katy, to what extent does also their inclusion in either on wedding garments or in court garments, things like that, where they're representing either status or an importance of an event. Is that also a factor, like when they're being worn? Um, are they special in that way, or are these like everyday objects as well?
This would be, I mean, it's a courtly robe. So it's already kind of it's an elite, it's something that is available to an elite few. I don't think that something like this robe would necessarily have like a ceremonial function, but it is something that is being worn by somebody with a high status in a high status situation where they're being seen. um, and yes, so this would even if it's not necessarily of religious or ceremonial significance, something like this garment. Um, I still don't think it would be considered like every day. It would be considered special. Yeah.
Does anyone have any last questions? Katie or Joshua, any questions for each other?
I'm good. I just wanted to clarify that this was the stamp I showed previously, but when you mentioned the nail one, I do have one with nails. I just
Oh,
that is in the
wow.
same box, like the
Oh
archival
my
box.
gosh, that's
So it's
great.
kind of a funny thing that like just right and left hands, but yeah, they are. Um, although I think this one is of European manufacture, not, but
Mm.
that is actually metallic um, pins.
And where did you acquire that?
This one came from an antique shop in Essex, Connecticut, but
Cool.
probably because Connecticut was a textiles, all the rivers that run through is a textile
Mhm.
space. So, which is kind of funny.
Very cool.
And then actually, I do believe this one is a different one that was a gift, but I think that these might be these little sort of like coffee bean motifs on the
Mm.
edge remind me very much of like a stamp version of the bindi um, tie.
Could very well be referencing a
Yeah,
type
meant to emulate it.
dot. Yeah, definitely. I'm just sort of flipping through these, but I'm not finding my bindies, but
Okay.
yeah. Yeah.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Katie and Joshua. Um, I hope that everyone will come back and see it and really take the time to look at the pieces on the wall because they are incredibly intricate, and especially when, as we were discussing, they are doing needlework on paper. So it's not a very solid, substantial substance. So that kind of makes it even more impressive.
And many of those pieces of paper were laser cut prior to being handled, so they're even more sensitive. That I did want to ask Neil at one point was like, how many times did you break one of these? But I didn't have it in my heart to do it. But to say like, when you got to a certain point and it just tore, what did you do? Um,
Yeah, it was amazing. It was really fun. I wish everyone could have gone through with Katie and Joshua and Abby. Um, you just look a little bit closer, and I hope that everyone will take the time to do that. Which, speaking of which, we have some great programs coming up. As I said, this is the first in a three-part series. The second one will be on October 28th, and we will be visiting the Penn Museum, and we can see these textiles in person. And then the third is on November 5th with Abby Lua, and she is going to talk about textiles in the context of different cultures and how that impacts the different patterns and designs. And we also have our book club. We are reading Threads of Life, and it tells a story, the history of textiles. It's really fascinating. So I would encourage you to come to any of those. We also have yoga and we have seated mindfulness and movement So a lot of things going on, a lot of ways for you to interact and see the exhibit. So again, thank you very much. Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Joshua. I learned so much. It was just fascinating. Um, and I think that's it. So good night, everybody.
You.
Have a good night. Thank you so much, Katie.